Prepare to experience the strongest radio allowable by law. Secrets will be revealed. Myths dispelled. From the studio gym where excuses never apply, it's Superhuman Radio with your host, Carl Lenore.
Welcome back to another episode of Superhuman Radio. Today is May 4th, 2020. We're 47 days into quarantine, self-imposed lockdown, keeping people safe. You see, this is my COVID mask. This is it. I walked into Kroger's today. I don't know why. Everybody put their hands up. I had to take it off like that. I don't want to scare people. Anyway, we have a great show. This is a topic that we've talked about for years, but we keep learning more and more. We're going to talk about the aging brain in just a moment. Before we get started, we have to pay homage to our title sponsor, Legendary Foods, the makers of fine foods with little to no sugar, which is really important. It actually fits nicely in this discussion today because we're talking about glucose and ketones and something we talked about on this show almost 10 years ago. That was called type 3 diabetes, insulin resistance of the brain, low glucose levels being used in the brain. It's going to be part of the discussion today. Legendary Foods has a Pop-Tart. It's called a Tasty Pastry, but it's a Pop-Tart 2.0. It's upgraded because it has 9 grams of high-quality, high-leucine protein and less than 1 gram of sugar. It's good for you. It's good for your kids. Go to eatlegendary.com. Use the coupon code SHR10, and you will save 10% off your entire order. Don't forget their nut butters are fantastic. I crave sugar sometimes. I just take a tablespoon of one of their nut butters, which have no sugars added, but they taste like they do, which satisfies that sweet tooth for me. You should check them out. Again, eatlegendary.com. The code is SHR10, 10% off all the things you buy there, including the ridiculously amazing Tasty Pastry. And we're going to hide some things here. I'm going to bring my guest on now, make things look pretty here. Let's get rid of that. I produce my own shows, you know. Welcome to the show, Dr. Lilianne Mujica-Parodi. How are you?
Thank you so much, Carl, for the invitation. I'm so happy to be here.
You've got good information that we love to talk about on this show. And we've been talking about the ketogenic diet in specific since 2005, believe it or not, before it became in vogue. Dr. Mauro Di Pasquale wrote a book 35 years ago for athletes using a phase shift diet, as he called it, which was a high fat, moderate protein during the week and a carb refeed on the weekend. And a lot of people saw great results from that, both in performance and body fat redistribution. So your study is called Diet Modulates Brain Network Stability and a Biomarker of Brain Aging in Young Adults. Why this study? What preceded this study that required you to take a deeper look?
So one of the things that I think makes my lab a little bit unique is that we tend to be very question-driven rather than technique-driven, which is to say that usually people kind of work in some particular area and they focus on that area for most of their careers and they become sort of the domain experts in that area over many, many decades. And in my lab, we seem to be sort of drawn to questions very much at the edge of what's known, and then we follow the questions, and that sometimes takes us across many different areas of a field or even across fields. So initially, the question that I was grappling with 10 years ago, 20 years ago even, was about stress resilience. Originally, in the context of psychiatric illness, trying to understand why some individuals were more vulnerable to psychiatric illness than others, and if we could understand the circuits that are responsible for one type of psychiatric illness versus another, if we can diagnose them based on dysregulation of those circuits. But gradually that work then led me to stress resilience thinking mechanistically about the way the circuit works. And one of the things that is very well known in stress research is that the brain becomes temporarily brain damaged under stress. That is to say, there are parts of the brain, specifically parts of the prefrontal cortex and hippocampus, that behave as if you're actually, you become brain damaged. And over short periods of time, that can be temporary. So often you probably have experienced this phenomenon of, when you're stressed, you start losing things, right? Or if for people who are afraid of public speaking, they'll give a talk and they'll sort of forget what they wanted to say. But over long periods of time, so particularly when you're dealing with people who've been in chronic stressors like combat, that kind of damage can become permanent. And it turns out that the mechanism behind this, and this was something that, even though I'd been working in that space for a while, only became really clear a couple of years ago, that the mechanism behind that brain damage is actually that the neurons become insulin resistant. So if you think about it, so the rest of the body could be absolutely not insulin resistant, but there's something about glucocorticoids that disable neurons by making them insulin resistant. And specifically what that seems to do is to impair the ability of neurons to effectively utilize fuel, specifically glucose. And as a result, they don't function properly. And the circuits become disrupted, cognition is disrupted. And so I remember looking at this, so remember this is in the context purely of stress research. This was reported initially, to my knowledge, by, the people kind of working in that space were Bruce McEwen and Robert Sapolsky, who were the dominant people who were doing the animal research mechanistically on trying to understand this. But I remember reading one of Bob Sapolsky's articles, and this was like back in 1986 was the article, and seeing that he had this little footnote to this mechanism, which was that when he fed his animals ketones, the neurons recovered. And so here's a mechanism where, on the one hand, I was pretty shocked to find out that the mechanism for how glucocorticoids actually impair neurons is through their ability to utilize glucose. So here's evidence of insulin resistance of neurons, which I have to say, like in a neuroscience space, was pretty controversial, because until recently, people didn't even think that neurons utilized insulin. The assumption was that neurons were not insulin dependent. But then,
wait, I have to stop you there. But that is really in direct opposition to the discovery about 8 or 9 years ago that the brain makes its own insulin, which tells us that insulin is so important for the brain that it doesn't even want to depend on the pancreas.
So interestingly enough, once you start searching, you see that there were clues all along. There are all sorts of clues, and one of them was that there's this insulin-degrading enzyme, and the purpose of the insulin-degrading enzyme, as you might imagine, is to degrade insulin in the brain, which doesn't make sense if the brain doesn't have insulin. And there are receptors for insulin in the brain. But what I'm saying is that one of the interesting things, I came from a background in mathematical logic initially, and then moved into theoretical physics and whatnot. And these fields are very much about integrating many different areas. But biology tends not to work that way. People tend to focus on their own specific cottage areas. And as a result, it was very possible, even 2 years ago, to find very high-ranking neuroscientists who would argue very strenuously that the brain does not utilize insulin. And in fact, to find this in medical textbooks. At the same time, that if you actually dug things out a little bit, you would actually find that there were papers in Nature and PNAS that actually were reporting the effects of insulin on the brain. So there's an advantage in specializing, in the sense that you can have a very deep knowledge about what it is you're doing, but the disadvantage is that you can become somewhat closeted in terms of your understanding of the larger context.
Right.
And so my point is that on the one hand, like, okay, so here's this amazing piece of information from my perspective as a stress researcher, is that the mechanism is insulin dependent. But the even more amazing piece of research that was just sort of thrown in there was that ketones were able to bypass this insulin resistance. So, well, that's kind of
okay. So,
right?
so I've got more questions. So, from an evolutionary perspective, does it make sense why, when you're under great deals of stress, the brain wants to not access those stressful events any longer? You know, in modernity, stress is synthesized by watching the news and so on. But one of our evolutionary edicts is to be aware of the danger in our environment. But unfortunately, now because of the internet and everything, it goes way beyond our environment. Is there some evolutionary connection to why that would have been a good thing, to be able to have stress disrupt certain neurons to where certain memories may have been stored?
So the important thing to understand about these evolutionary explanations is that you want to be careful that you don't lapse into what's known as just so stories, right? So you have some phenomenon.
Just what? Say that again.
You want to be careful, not you particularly. I mean, one wants to be careful that one doesn't lapse into with, just so stories.
Okay.
So it's very possible to come up with a potential explanation that is very reasonable, but the issue is what often happens in evolution is that in optimizing over one parameter, you de-optimize over another. And so if your top priority as an animal is avoiding predation, it could be that your top priority is mobilizing glucose into the muscles and making you run as fast as possible. But the areas of the brain that suffer for it may not be, that those may not be the, like, in other words, there's a trade-off. There's a trade-off. In getting away from the animal, you may have to take from somewhere else. And so what often happens is that not every biological solution is optimal over all possible parameters. There are trade-offs in biology. And very often what happens in biology, and we see this, we think, in aging, is that the body actually protects itself by reducing its consumption of glucose because it has less access to it, so it kind of reoptimizes so that it can do with less. But what happens as a result is that cognition takes a hit. So, it's good to sort of keep the wider context in mind.
Okay, so talk about this study. How was the study designed?
So starting from this place that I described, this initial study by Robert Sapolsky in 1986, and I'm not that old, so I was a kid. It's not like I was reading this when it came out, but at the same time, that's the beauty of having this historical record of articles that are available. Is sometimes you go back and there's something very surprising that you can learn from as if it were new. And it occurred to me that this was potentially an extraordinary thing because as people age, their brains become hypometabolic. And what I mean by that is it's a little bit deceiving to say they become hypometabolic because what people mean by hypometabolic is hypometabolic with respect to a particular fuel, which is glucose. So the way this is typically measured is with FDG PET. So you have a radioactive tag to glucose and you inject it and then you see where it goes to the brain and then how quickly it gets utilized. And what happens as people grow older is that the brain stops utilizing glucose as effectively. And I should back up and say initially this was seen for dementia, right? So in dementia, you see very pronounced hypometabolism. In Alzheimer's disease, you see very pronounced hypometabolism. In fact, that's one of the ways you diagnose dementia is with FDG PET. But here's the rub. It's not an all or nothing thing. It's not as if you're fine, and then one day you wake up and you're hypometabolic and you can't think clearly. It's actually a pretty gradual process. Mm-hmm. And if you go back and you look at, for example, what happens with mild cognitive impairment, you see some hypometabolism. So it seemed on the one hand that there was sort of a more gradual process of hypometabolism. And then on the other, Bob Sapolsky's paper suggested that if, in fact, the brain couldn't utilize glucose, and if, in fact, there were this back door to feed these neurons, then maybe, just maybe, we might have sort of a trick to reverse this, this really critical factor in brain aging, which is the brain's inability to utilize glucose. So if we can give it an alternate fuel source, the idea is we can rejuvenate the brain. So that was the thought process. So in the study, the study really had three components. And this study isn't over. It has kind of ongoing directions that I'm happy to talk about. But the first one was to first establish what hypometabolism looks like in a way that is kind of non-specific for fuel type. So if you look at FDG PET, you are only looking at how the brain is utilizing one type of fuel, which is glucose. But what we care about ultimately, from a functional standpoint, is how is the brain utilizing any type of fuel? Does the brain have the fuel it needs? Does it not? And what we found is that there was a particular signature for aging that had to do with communication between brain regions. So, whenever you are doing anything, even doing nothing, your brain is operating as a series of circuits and networks of different brain regions that are communicating with one another. And the degree to which you are able to function depends upon those networks actually being stable. They actually need to be able to continue to talk to one another without sort of fading out or staticking or reorganizing and so forth. On the other hand, by the way, I should mention, you don't want brain networks that are so static that they can't adjust. So you want to be able to switch from doing one thing to doing to another thing. And so a healthy brain is not purely static. It is able to stabilize sufficiently to be functional, but then is able to adjust and to move on to other things as needed. But what we found is that as people grew older, the brain networks started to destabilize. That is to say, they're sort of connected to one another, but if you look at the same network over time, it starts to disintegrate. And what it was doing was not just fading out, it was actually turning into a different network. It was actually switching from one network to a different one, which is kind of interesting behavior. You might imagine, for example, like with a light bulb, that as the light bulb is kind of running out of energy, it might start flickering. Mm-hmm. But that's not what was happening. It was actually a network is running out of fuel and it starts actually reorganizing into a different configuration. The second piece of information, though, that was very important was that, again, it did not happen all at once. There was actually a very kind of long-term degenerative process that started in the late 40s. So, around the age of 47, you started to see the degeneration of these networks. It became very sharply accelerated around the age of 60, and then became kind of to the point where it didn't change that much after around the age of 72. And the third piece of information that was important was that this process became accelerated in type 2 diabetics. Mm-hmm. So if you happen to be a diabetic, a type 2 diabetic, this curve shifted to the left. So in other words, the process of aging where you were at 65 became more like where a type 2 diabetic would be in his 50s, per se. So it's an acceleration of the brain aging process, which was also accompanied by lower cognition. We then, once we had a pretty clear-cut signature for what brain aging looked like, we wanted to find out, could we manipulate it? So is this just a fact of aging? Is this just something that becomes fixed? So for example, you could imagine a situation where your brain structurally reorganizes, and it is what it is, and you can't do anything about it. So we put people on several different dietary regimes. One was just their normal standard American diet, which, as you know, tends to be rather high glycemic. The second was fasting, and the third was 1 week on a ketogenic diet. Now, 1 week isn't a very long time. And to be honest, we were, to remove age out of the equation, we were only testing individuals who were younger because we wanted to see what is the effect of the diet without confounding that with the age effects right away. And what was actually quite striking is that the same individuals, and remember we're talking about young individuals, their networks stabilized during fasting and also during the ketogenic diet. So at this point, you might ask yourself, well, but these people were insulin resistant. So what's the mechanism for that? If they weren't missing glucose, if they weren't hypometabolic, how come changing their diets then provided a backdoor for additional fuel? So there are many ways to think about what might have happened, and part of what we're trying to figure out now is really what the mechanism is. But one possibility came from Richard Veitch's work, and what he found with his colleague Sato was that actually ketones, even in people who are non-hypometabolic, and here he was really, when I say people, he was working with animals, actually produces about 27% more available energy, biologically available energy, than glucose. And the organ that he was focusing on was the heart. So he showed that there was more cardiac output. And of course, people like Karen Clark were looking at other muscles because she was working with elite athletes. What she found is that even, again, in healthy young people who are not in a deficit state, ketones produced, and here I mean by ketones, beta-hydroxybutyrate, produced more energy, more available energy than the same amount of calorically matched glucose. So now we've got sort of an interesting neuroscience finding, which is that the brain, even in a non-deficit state, seems to benefit from more energy. And here's what it looks like, right? So, but, here we moved on because here's the problem. When you put people on diets, lots of things change. Mm-hmm. They, as you know, I mean, a ketogenic diet, because of the fat content, might produce more satiety, and therefore you might eat less, and that might affect your caloric, content, or it might affect other macronutrients that kind of go along for the ride. And so we then followed up by isolating the fuel source as a very precise variable. We had people coming in on 2 days in a fasting state. One day, we scanned them first, then we gave them a bolus of glucose and then scanned them again. On the other day, we scanned them and then gave them a bolus of beta-hydroxybutyrate and scanned them again.
Was that beta-hydroxybutyrate that the Veitch ketone ester?
Yeah.
Okay.
And so here's the thing. I mean, the glucose and the beta-hydroxybutyrate were two fuel sources with exactly the same amount of caloric, the same number of calories in them. So it wasn't the number of calories.
Right.
It was the type of fuel, and it was weight dosed. So everybody had, the same amount based on their particular weight. It was 395 milligrams per kilogram. And so we actually saw the same results, the same stabilization of networks in response to both the fasting and the ketone condition. So we then did one more experiment, which was to ask if we put someone on a high glycemic index diet, is it what we're taking away or is it what we're adding? So in other words, is what's happening that we're taking away the glucose, or is what's happening that we're adding the ketone? So what we did is we then had people on a high glycemic diet consuming a bolus of sugar, which would be sort of the equivalent of eating a piece of chocolate cake or donuts, whatever, and then gave them the ketone. And the ketone again stabilized the networks. So then we established essentially that it was the ketone itself. And how does that work? Well, interestingly enough, what that showed is that the brain, when it has the choice between glucose and ketones, it goes for the ketones. And the reason for that, probably, again, here we're getting into one of those evolutionary just so stories that I'm a little suspicious of, but ketones evolved within a context of starvation. Right.
And when we had to have all of our senses working because we had a short window of time to straighten things out.
So the way the biology works is if there are ketones there, grab them, because there's not a whole lot of fuel. Like, you can't be choosy. So if there's glucose, it actually gets pushed into the cell. If there's ketones, it gets pushed into the cell. Whereas with glucose, it gets pulled in only as required. So if your cells don't have sufficient glucose, then there's a mechanism through glucagon to actually push them in. Through insulin to push them in. But with ketones, it doesn't matter. If you have ketones, they get pushed into the cell. And so when you have access to both, what seemed to be happening was that the brain was going for the ketones and then suppressing the glucose. It actually was actually quite striking, because we had people's glucose levels going from like 180 to like 70 within 10 minutes. It was working like a drug for type 2 diabetes.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, it's very fascinating. In fact, we've had shows specifically about the effects of the ketogenic diet and also beta hydroxybutyrate with Dr. Dominic D'Agostino's lab and lots of people now. And it's just phenomenal to me, because I will use the Veach ketone esters. I get them from a company called Ketone Aid. And they don't pay me anything for the plugs. I love their product. But it's amazing, because I'll take some ketones, even though I eat a very low glycemic diet. I'm a low carb guy. But I'll take those and I'll still feel them, even though I'm in a fed state, which speaks to your observations. So Ivo Sue, who watches the show from very, very far away, he said that some people get an elevated heart rate from the ketogenic diet. Do you think it's because the ketones are more efficient and they increase cardiac output?
So Kieran Clark's work would suggest, and Richard Veach's work would suggest that in fact they do increase cardiac output, but I have also seen that they increase epinephrine. So at least in the beginnings, there seems to be this adrenaline response to ketones that I think also may interfere with sleep. So lots of people have observed that you get this very clear rush, of energy when you consume ketones. I run and I definitely feel it. If I've just consumed ketones before I run, I definitely feel a change in performance. But I'm not sure if we know if that's because of the 27% more ATP that's available, or if it's actually because of this adrenaline response.
Well, it's funny, because when I generally fast anywhere from 12 to 16 hours a day, just because I like time restricted feeding. It works for me. But if I fast for 24 hours, I literally feel euphoric. So much so that the idea of eating is discouraging. I think, do I want to eat and this is going to go away? And I've fasted regularly for 3 days, and I've trained intensely, and I've had some of my best lifting days on a 72-hour fast. It is a euphoric sensation that you get from the ketones, and it's again, I like to look at everything from an evolutionary standpoint. I feel like evolution is smarter than us, and we have to try to understand why these things have happened. Are they benefits or in the context? And I think, well, if you're starving, you can't be down on your luck. You got to be motivated. Like, hey, around the next corner, I may find something to eat. And I kind of feel like that's part of the reason. And again, I'm not a scientist.
Fasting does seem to trigger neurogenesis in the hippocampus, for example. I mean, people have observed that, in fact, it does trigger this sort of compensatory neurogenesis in areas of the brain that would be associated with spatial reasoning, which would be necessary if you were foraging. But I would also point out, and here's something that we also tested, which I didn't mention. So when you start an experiment, if you are careful about it, you don't just jump into doing an experiment. You often do some piloting beforehand to establish some key parameters. Because at least what I do is neuroimaging, and it's a very expensive technology. So we're often talking about like $1,200 to $2,000 a data point. You don't want to screw up. So one of the things that we didn't know was exactly what the time course was of beta hydroxybutyrate in the brain. Nobody had really done neuroimaging, functional neuroimaging. And by that, I mean fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging of beta-hydroxybutyrate. So imagine, you do this experiment and you give someone beta-hydroxybutyrate, but at some point you have to put them in the scanner. And like, when do you do that? Do you wait half an hour? Do you wait 10 minutes? How long does it take? And so the first thing we did was we did a time course study, and we gave people glucose, again, on one day, ketones on the other, and scanned them for, like an hour and a half to see what is the time course of how it hits the brain. Because, people have studied how it hits the blood, but we were interested in the brain. And what was very interesting, and this is in that paper as well, it's in the appendix, is that if you look at the time course, which we measured with magnetic resonance spectroscopy, so magnetic resonance spectroscopy is a way actually to look at the chemistry of the brain. So what is the substance that's in the brain and how is it changing over time? And one of the things that was very striking was that, so we established the time course, that's fine. But what was really striking to me was that if you look at the time course, the glucose is like all over the place. It's up and down, up and down, up and down, up and down. It's incredibly variable. And the reason for that is that, again, you've got this glucose insulin, going back and forth.
And insulin oscillates. What people don't realize is that insulin is on demand and
exactly. So you've got these control circuits that are making this going up and down, up and down, up and down. It's a very unstable fuel source, whereas the ketone goes up, stays up, So it's a much more stable, slow-burning fuel source, which means that you're not going to get as hungry because you're not going to get into a state of hypoglycemia. It's very possible to have, a bunch of donuts, and then what happens is that you have this, endogenous release of insulin, which then plummets you into a state of postprandial hypoglycemia, and at this point you become ravenous again, right? So what happens with ketones is that because they are a more slow-burning and stable fuel source, I think that mitigates some of that hunger right away.
That's fascinating. We have to take a break. I've got lots more questions. This is a great discussion because we've always suspected a lot of the things that you're telling me were validated in a lot of this research. So it really helps a lot. People have been saying that the brain prefers ketones, but really no one has ever actually looked at some of the parameters that would indicate that that's true. So this is great. I'm so excited. We're going to take one quick commercial break. We'll be right back with more Superhuman Radio. If you're watching live, then why don't you share the show, start a watch party, and get more people to listen. We'll be right back. Ever wish there was a precise way to gauge your recovery from workout to workout? Or wonder if the money you're spending on your nootropic supplements are actually improving brain function? Maybe you're aging and you're noticing some changes in memory. Wouldn't being able to really test your brain be of great value? Well, now you can with great accuracy with the Brain Gauge. The Brain Gauge lets you test essential components of brain health and track your brain health history, and all in the comfort of your own home. Go to gaugeyourbrain.com and use code SHR for $150 off this amazing device. That's gaugeyourbrain.com and SHR for $150 off.
New Mass Pro Synthogen X2 just upped its own legendary game. To distance itself even further from the rest of the pack, Synthogen X2 now has double the key active ingredients. If you've ever wondered what steroid-like recovery feels like, Synthogen X2 delivers. See why others compare it favorably to powerful bodybuilding drugs at synthogen.com. Mass Pro Synthogen. When you train with it, you'll gain with it.
7,451. That's how many people kick the bucket, buy the farm, or cash in their chips every day in the United States. Yep, that means 5 people are going to meet their maker during this commercial. And no, our commercials are not the cause. Half of those who punch the clock for the final time will do so without life insurance. Call Big Lou at Term Provider before you are number 7452. If you're a 50-year-old male, a tad porky with a touch of diabetes, $1 million of term life insurance may only cost about $200 a month. With more verified 5-star reviews than any other Lou on the radio, Big Lou has saved thousands of people thousands on their term insurance premiums. Stop procrastinating and call Big Lou today at 800-560-0301. 800-560-0301. Remember, Big Lou's like you. He doesn't want to be number 7,452. Call 800-560-0301 or biglou.com.
Imagine if you had a digital twin, one that you could compare your own health and fitness outcomes to, one that showed you whether or not the things you're doing, food you're eating, or drinks you're drinking are actually working for you or against you. Well, now you can. The first ever advanced epigenetic saliva test that compares 20 million different data points of your DNA to help predict what is aging you faster or keeping you younger is being introduced to my audience at a 70% discount from the normal price. Go to seeds.md/epigenetic-test today to learn how to get your own digital twin that will help you take the steps to live longer and stay stronger. Don't wait, because this is a limited time offer not available anywhere else. Once these tests are gone, they're gone. Again, go to seeds.md/epigenetic-test today to learn more. Do you remember those delicious toaster pastries you had when you were a kid? You know, the rectangular sugar-filled snacks? Well, guess what? Legendary Foods has just made low-carb toaster pastry. This is the first of its kind, and honestly, these things are amazing. They have 3 to 4 net carb, less than 1 gram of sugar, and 9 grams of protein. You can eat them right out of the wrapper or lightly toast them. The only question is, which flavor, strawberry or brown sugar cinnamon? They're available at eatlegendary.com and Amazon.
This is the Superhuman Channel, where brawn and brains finally meet.
Welcome back. So many of you know I had to give up coffee because coffee was jacking up my gut really bad. And since I've given up coffee, I don't snore anymore. I don't have GERD anymore. I knew it was the coffee, and I've tried every type of coffee. I know they're going to say, oh, Carl, you got to use this coffee and that coffee. And nah, coffee today for me, maybe not for you, is not a good thing. But I missed that morning ritual of waking up, perking the water, putting it in a cup, and sipping something hot until I found out about Organifi.com. They have a product called Organifi Pure. And it's like 11 different superfoods, but one that I'm really interested in, which is lion's mane, which has a neuroprotective effect and has been shown clinically to increase BDNF and upregulate some of the things that we want as we age to increase neuroplasticity. I've been drinking Organifi Pure ever since I gave up coffee. I don't miss coffee anymore. And the other thing that happened when I stopped drinking coffee was I felt it. I couldn't think. I couldn't remember things. I had a struggle with, I mean, those of you who've been watching this show or listening to me for the past 14 years know my stock in trade is my memory. I can remember interviews and discussions I had from 10 years ago like they were yesterday. But when I stopped drinking coffee, that was it. I couldn't remember anything anymore. Organifi Pure saved me, and it saved my gut too. First of all, it ships right to your door, which is convenient, especially today because you can't go out to stores half the time. They have a reoccurring delivery program that's fantastic. Organifi Pure is USDA certified organic, dairy-free, gluten-free, keto-friendly, soy-free, and 100% vegan. If you go to Organifi.com/SHR and use the code SHR, you get 15% off to try this stuff. It saved my life. I kid you not. I would not start a morning without it ever again. So check them out, and we'll get right back to the discussion here now. We'll bring, I got to get rid of something here. I produce my own shows, so, I don't have a producer here. I got to do it all. So we're talking right now with Dr. Lilianne Mujica-Parodi. We're talking about her recent research on brain aging and the effects of dietary regimens. And I think it was end of last year, I read a study that showed that a low carbohydrate diet can reverse the markers of brain aging. And now I'm starting to suspect it's because people have higher levels of ketones, maybe, because I've checked my ketone levels just after a 12-hour fast. I stop eating at 6 p.m. I go to bed at 9. I'm a very boring person. And when I wake up in the morning, if I check my blood glucose levels, I'm already at 1 millimole just from that short period of time. Do you think that the reason that the low carb diet showed the reversal of brain aging is because intrinsically it's producing more ketones?
Yes. So the fact that we saw the same effects with fasting and administering ketones is pretty clearly showing that the two are doing essentially the same thing. When you go into fasting, you endogenously produce ketones. When you take ketones, you're exogenously taking ketones. But the brain doesn't seem to care one way or the other. As I said, the way that the neurophysiology seems to work is if the ketones are available, they get taken up.
So one of the things, because I'm 62 years old now, and I don't like aging. I don't like it at all. I can tell you that. And so, one of the things that I strive to do is try to understand what is it really that's going on in my body when it ages. I mean, surely my cells don't have, I know they have clocks, but they don't know that I'm 62 years old. But something happens. When I had Dr. Dale Bredesen on a couple times over the course of the past 5 or 6 years after he wrote his book and did his initial studies on reversing Alzheimer's disease with a multifaceted protocol, I became fascinated in 2010 with iron accumulation for a variety of reasons. And his discussion and research shows that brain accumulation of iron contributes to the onset of what we consider dementia or Alzheimer's disease. A recent study that I talked about on the show showed that senescent cells have 6 to 10-fold more iron than quiescent cells. And now a study I read last quarter shows that the more iron you store, the more insulin resistant you become. Is it possible that it's not chronological aging at all, but since we're on the planet longer and we're eating more things with iron, we're accumulating more iron, and this could be the reason that we see these changes in our brain?
I don't think I can answer that question. I think if I had tested this specifically, I could. I'm not familiar with the research that you're describing, so I wouldn't feel comfortable commenting on it.
Okay.
I think that one thing that does make this kind of research complicated, particularly when you're looking at naturalistic studies where you have like large groups of people and you look at what happens during aging, is that a lot of things happen during aging. One of the things that happens is that there are immune factors that change with aging and even with diet. There's this insulin degrading enzyme and the accumulation of beta amyloid plaque and all of those things. And certainly you can create a narrative for how all of those things are related to one another. So, for example, you could imagine that people who are becoming insulin resistant, they are accumulating more glucose, and therefore, because an insulin degrading enzyme has to do two jobs, it has to remove insulin, but it also needs to clear the brain of beta amyloid plaque. What happens is that if it's spending all of its time clearing insulin because someone's insulin resistant, then it doesn't do as effective a job at clearing out the plaque. And then, so ultimately, as I started off talking about, I think that what's going to have to be required is gradually moving to a more integrative understanding of how all of these pieces of the puzzle fit together. Because I think what often happens is that, because people work on particular things, one person says, oh, I studied this, it must be this. And another person says, well, I did this experiment, it must be that. But the reality is that, like that very old cliche about the elephant and the blind man trying to understand the elephant, you're only seeing the part that you look at. And so ultimately there's going to be an effort as the data accumulate to start trying to come up with a picture that incorporates all of these different pieces of the puzzle. For me, what was necessary was to kind of go back and think about this from first principles and say, you know what, I'm a little bit scared to try to identify a mechanism in old people because old people have so many things that look different. If I go back and look at at young people and I look at how, in fact, this particular one variable of fuel affects the brain, then I can take that information and then move to an older population or to an insulin-resistant population.
Right.
And at least I'm just kind of taking one step at a time, isolating variables one at a time, so that, for example, I can exclude inflammatory markers or beta insulin, the insulin degrading enzyme, because these are factors that wouldn't operate on the time scale that I was measuring. These are effects that we saw with the beta hydroxybutyrate on the order of 10 minutes, to 30 minutes, right? So these are effects that are too fast to be lots of the other mechanisms that we think might be relevant cumulatively, but this is something that happened too fast to be able to incorporate those mechanisms.
Do we know? I'm sorry. Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
The other thing I wanted to mention apropos of your comment about, measuring your blood in the morning, for a long time, people were measuring their urine, and the move to measure blood seems like it's a step forward to measuring urine. What happens, of course, is that over time, so what you excrete through urine is the overproduction of ketones, right? So what happens is that when you switch from burning glucose to burning ketones, you have to produce ketones, and your body doesn't know in the beginning how many it needs to produce. And so it produces an overabundance in the beginning, and that's why you excrete the ones you don't need. But what happens is that the longer you're on a ketogenic diet, the more your body downregulates and produces only the ketones that you require, which means that if you're assaying the effects of a ketogenic diet with urine, over time you may think that you're not, in ketosis anymore because the urine isn't helping. But there are problems also with measuring blood, and specifically to address the issue that you raised. So one thing that a lot of people don't know, and in fact I didn't know until I started measuring it, is that the brain runs out of glucose a lot faster than the rest of the body does. And so typically when you go on a ketogenic diet or you're fasting, the rest of your body requires about 30 to 36 hours to transition to burning your own fat in the form of ketones. But your brain has a much smaller storage container. And as a result, it actually switches to burning ketones after 5 to 10 hours, which means that you could be measuring your blood in the morning and not be in a ketogenic state in terms of the rest of your body, but your brain is in a ketogenic state. So a lot of people say, well, I wouldn't naturally burn ketones because I'm not fasting, but everyone's fasting. I mean, unless you're getting up every 2 hours to eat while you're sleeping, everyone goes through a fasting period. And one of the reasons that ketosis has evolved is to allow you to do things like sleep, because you don't have to eat as regularly. So anyway, I just wanted to make that point, because one thing that we often try to do when we study these things in ourselves is to try to adapt measurements that we see in the laboratory to our own metrics. But this is something to consider. This is one reason that we had to measure it in the brain.
I want to take our last commercial break, and when we come back, I want to ask you specifically, is there a way to determine how long the brain needs to be exposed to ketones to start to reverse some of the, let's say, stress-induced changes or age-related changes? And do we know how high ketone levels need to be, or is there any way to measure that when we come back? We're going to take one quick commercial break. Stay tuned. We shall return. Later in the show, I'm going to give you a little Virology 101. We're going to talk about the coronavirus a little bit. I know a lot of people have been asking me to do some stuff on that, so we have an interesting discussion later in the show. Stay tuned. I love beef, and if you love beef, listen up. I've discovered the best tasting beef in the world, and that's not an exaggeration, at Piedmontese.com. The Piedmontese breed is famous from Italy for being lean and unbelievably tender with half the fat and calories of traditional beef. Even typically tough cuts are tender when it comes from the Piedmontese cows. And for the first time ever, Piedmontese cows are being raised here in the USA. Get 2 free 10-ounce New York strips when you purchase $50 or more at Piedmontese.com with code SHR. Go to PIEDMONTESE.com and use code SHR today. You will never eat any other type of beef ever again. Crank your muscle gains to new heights by transforming every gram of protein you eat into 3 grams with Masszymes. With 100,000 AQTs of protease per capsule, Masszymes increases your absorption of key amino acids, resulting in stronger, healthier digestion of proteins and certain vitamins that not only multiplies the impact of the protein you eat, but can also repair a damaged intestinal wall. Go to Masszymes/SHR for 10% off. That's MASSZYMES.com/SHR. Hey, this is Carl. For 14 years, you've heard me talk about Can-C eye drops, and they being the reason that I do not need reading glasses at now 61 years old. But I regularly get emails and messages from people who've been using Can-C and having some amazing results. Recently, I got an email from a fellow named Chad, who, because he was on dexamethasone eye drops for over 6 months, developed a cataract. Can-C eye drops actually reduced my cataract to the point where even my doctor has a hard time finding it. I will never stop using Can-C eye drops twice a day. I've been using them since 2008, he says. And you should be too. There is no better way to keep your eyes healthy and seeing clearly than Can-C eye drops. Go to wisechoicemedicine.com today and get on board, and we will both be looking into the future with very clear vision. How often do you sit with your laptop right on your lap? How much time do you spend on your cell phone? Are you in a technology-packed office Monday through Friday? Are you worried about this type of radiation? Now there's something you can do about it. GetLambs.com. This radiation has been linked to infertility in men, glandular tumors, gut microbiome dysbioses, and impaired sleep quality. Now you can provide 360-degree protection to at-risk parts of your body with radiation-proof apparel from GetLambs.com. Comfortable, breathable, and 99% effective. Go to GetLambs.com and use coupon code SHR for 20% off your order of $100 or more. That's GetLambs.com, GetLambs.com, and code SHR.
Men and women, you've heard about hormone optimization. Do you feel like it's something you want to look into? RenewLifeRx.com is the place to start. Their doctors can help you with the solutions. RenewLifeRx.com has a simple process for lab work, consultation, and taking a deep dive into where your hormone levels can be improved. Superhuman Radio listeners get 30% off your initial lab work and consultation. Go to RenewLifeRx.com to schedule your no-obligation phone consultation today. Feel younger, get in better shape, and be more productive at RenewLifeRx.com.
You're listening to the Superhuman Channel. We're ripped and we're ready.
Welcome back. We're talking with Dr. Lilianne Mujica-Parodi. This is a fascinating discussion because I love discussions that shed light into actionable steps that we can take to protect our brain, because so many people in our population today are developing issues related to dementia and Alzheimer's disease at younger and younger ages. It's a very, very sad situation. So do you think, is there a way to give us any type of quantification of how long it takes for the brain to be exposed to ketones, let's say with great regularity, to start to see some of these mechanistic changes away from the aging brain phenomenon?
One of the things that was very surprising and very striking about this study was how short a time it took to see effects. And again, here we're talking about healthy young individuals. Right now, we are doing experiments in older individuals up to the age of 80, as well as individuals with insulin resistance, and also looking at animal studies to better understand mechanistically what is going on. But I will say with the healthy young individuals, we saw an effect after 1 week on a ketogenic diet, which is not a long time at all, and after 30 minutes after consuming beta-hydroxybutyrate.
That's so exciting.
Yeah, it means you don't have to do this for years to see an effect.
When the subjects were on the ketogenic diet, did you measure blood levels, or how did you determine if they were actually in ketosis and how deep they were?
Yes, so we did measure blood levels, probably very similarly to how you were measuring them. So it seems to be a switch. Either you're burning ketones or you're not. We did not find that being more ketogenic was better. So for example, one pilot experiment we did involved fasting, having people be on a ketogenic diet, and then also giving them the ketone or not. And what we found is that once you're in ketosis, being more in ketosis doesn't make your brain behave better. It's either it's burning ketones or it's burning glucose. And the dose, there is no dose response effect that we could notice. We did notice that, and here we didn't do these experiments ourselves, but we relied on our collaborator, Kieran Clark, who had done experiments with the dose response study. And what happens is that at least when you take exogenous ketones, past a certain point, you start seeing some gastrointestinal side effects. And so what we found was that 395 milligrams per kilogram was sort of a sweet spot in terms of reliably getting people to the point where they were definitely in ketosis, but not to the point where they started feeling nauseous.
Fascinating. So, boy, I have too many questions in my head. So I'm just going to stick with this one here. So, and the reality is, if you're at because there's a phenomenon called ketolysis, which is the utilization of ketones by the body, and then there's ketosis, which is the production of ketones by the body. And so, from what you just said, is it safe to say that if you are producing ketones, even if it's just 1 millimole, that your brain most likely is using them, since the brain seems to prefer them?
This is what we found. So when we looked at people who were endogenously producing more or
Supplemental,
or less ketones, we were not seeing a dose response effect.
Okay.
Basically, either they were in ketosis or they were not. Either the stability was stabilized or it was not.
I know you can't talk about, or you have to be cautious about talking about future research, but I have to believe you're working on other projects as a result of this project. Will you come back on the show and talk about your findings?
Sure. I would love to. I mean, I think one of the most exciting things is that, well, and again, this kind of makes our lab maybe a little bit unusual in the field, in that typically people, when they think about translational research, they first start with animals, and then they take it from the animal experiments up to the human scale. As a matter of kind of practical philosophy, we always work in the opposite direction. We first see some effect at the human scale, and then go to the animals to understand the mechanism. And the reason for that is that if there's no effect on the human scale, it doesn't make sense.
Oh, darn it. I can't believe we lost her. Oh man. Well, we were lucky to have her for as long as we did, given the internet challenges today. I'm going to see if I can get her back here. Oh, I hate it. I hate technology. I got to be honest with you. This is why I prefer to do shows. Here, hold on. Let me just see if I can reach her. Yeah, let's just do something real quick.
Hi.
Hey, I'm so.
Is currently unavailable.
Oh, darn it. Well, let's see if she reconnects, because we did talk about this possibly happening.
Hi.
No. We talked about this possibly happening, but I think we got all the really good details from the interview. I have to take my last commercial break, and when we come back, we're either going to be rejoined by Dr. Mujica-Parodi, or I'm going to talk about the absurdity of continuing to be locked down in light of what viruses actually do in human populations. And I think that when we connect these dots, people are going to get really, really interested. But let's take our last commercial break. Stay tuned. We'll be right back. Uh-oh. Something's wrong. Here we go. Ever wish there was a precise way to gauge your recovery from workout to workout? Or wonder if the money you're spending...
New Mass Pro Synthogen X2 just upped its own legendary game to distance itself.
7,451. That's how many people kick the bucket, buy the farm, or cash in their chips every day.
You've heard about blood flow restricted training since 2006 on SHR, but you're still on the fence. Well, here's the push. BFR is more effective at building muscle than anabolic steroids. That's right, I went there, but it's because it's the truth. My experience with the Be Strong blood flow restriction system is proof to me, and now I'm asking myself why I waited so long. You'll see undeniable changes in the targeted muscles in days and weeks like nothing you've ever tried before. I will never stop using them. Give Be Strong a try. Go to bestrong.training/super-human and use code SHR for 10% off. Whether your goal is to build muscle or burn fat, you'll find everything you need at Redcon One. Need help getting a good night's sleep? Try Fade Out, or the most popular pre-workout supplement on the market today, Total War. Sign up for their new Transformation Challenge and win $10,000, or shop for apparel that people at the gym will know that you are serious about your training. Need a testosterone booster that works? Check out Broomstick. Whatever you need, you'll find the best quality supplements on the market at Redcon One. Go to redcon1.com. That's REDCON, the number 1.com, or go to superhumanradio.net and click the Redcon One banner ad today.
Quest Nutrition makes bars, cookies, chips, and pizzas out of complete dairy-based proteins. Our products minimize net carbs and sugar without sacrificing taste. Each delicious chocolate-flavored chip, cookie chunk, and crunchy crumble is custom-made to maintain Quest macros. It's time to enjoy foods that work for you, not against you. It's time to enjoy your Quest.
Ever wish there was a precise way to gauge your recovery from workout to workout? Or wonder if the money you're spending on your nootropic supplements are actually improving brain function? Maybe you're aging and you're noticing some changes in memory. Wouldn't being able to really test your brain be of great value? Well, now you can with great accuracy with the Brain Gauge. The Brain Gauge lets you test essential components of brain health and track your brain health history, and all in the comfort of your own home. Go to gaugeyourbrain.com and use code SHR for $150 off this amazing device. That's gaugeyourbrain.com and SHR for $150 off. Do you remember those delicious toaster pastries you had when you were a kid? You know, the rectangular sugar-filled snacks? Well, guess what? Legendary Foods has just made low-carb toaster pastry. This is the first of its kind, and honestly, these things are amazing. They have 3 to 4 net carb, less than 1 gram of sugar, and 9 grams of protein. You can eat them right out of the wrapper or lightly toast them. The only question is, which flavor? Strawberry or brown sugar cinnamon? They're available at eatlegendary.com and Amazon.
Spit that out right now. This is the Superhuman Channel.
Okay, welcome back. Unfortunately, we're having some technical difficulty, but I have the good doctor on my phone, and we literally dropped you at the last second. Let's see if my audience can hear you. So you were wrapping things up. Do you remember where we dropped you? I don't.
Yeah, so what I was saying is that typically the way we envisage translational research is that you start from some animal experiment and then ask, oh, could this also be true in the human? But that can lead to situations where you do a great job of curing rat cancer, but it doesn't work in the human. There are many examples, actually, where animal results do not translate to the human because of lack of homology. But in any case, what we're doing now is having established this network stability measure in humans and knowing that it can be it can be adjusted through changing fuel sources and through changing the amount of energy available. We're now doing animal experiments in collaboration with a very talented electrophysiologist, Nathan Smith at Children's National in Washington, D.C. In his laboratory, he's actually taking mice and making them insulin resistant, and then looking at the neurons and how they change, how they communicate with one another, how they change their firing dynamics, so that we can try to understand the mechanism for the effects that we're seeing in humans. And so that's kind of where we're at right now. And it's very exciting. And we're seeing actually very profound effects in terms of how neurons communicate with one another and how even they fire in the presence of insulin resistance. So definitely stay tuned.
This is very exciting to me. And I appreciate you dealing with this last moment of technical difficulty. I want to have you back on. I think the work that you're doing is profoundly important as well for the population. So this is fantastic. Thank you so much for being here today.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for the invitation.
Take care.
Take care.
Bye. Bye-bye. Well, there you go. Manipulating technology to get the complete interview done. As always trying to deliver. I'm always trying to deliver. So the last thing I want to talk about is a brief intro to Virology 101 about the COVID-19 epidemic. I'm going to put my mask back on for this, just in case Dr. Tony Fauci is watching. I want him to see that I'm abiding. So I look more like Antifa now than somebody who's worried about catching the virus, right? So, okay, so there's this really bad notion that if we could lock the population down, let's say it was possible to completely lock the population down for the next 6 months. Let's say the government had enough money to give us money and give businesses money and keep everybody in gear. And we were like, okay, this is great. For 6 months, I'm just going to social distance, just do what I have to do, stay home, not work. And then when we all come out in 6 months, everybody will be safe. No one will get the virus. This is exactly a profound untruth. No one's talking about this in the media at all, what I'm about to say. Quite frankly, no one talked about vitamin D in the media and sun exposure. No one's talked about how this virus has seeded and spread. No one's talking about a lot of the things I talk about, but because my audience is this niche boutique audience and I don't reach millions and millions of people like, let's say, a Dr. Oz or somebody like that, I talk about things on this show, and then 2 weeks later, somebody is on CNN talking about it. I go to Elisa. I just talked about that. Like, I talked about the sex differences between contracting this virus before anybody did. So anyway, I know I'm patting my own back right now. My friend Jeff Ruey would say, never let the handprint on your back be your own. He says, I know what you're going to say. I've discussed this with friends. Fred Shora says, okay, Fred, stick with me, brother. So there's this notion that if we just lock the country down long enough, everybody will come out of this just alive. And that's not true. That's not how viruses work. So let's say we did lock the country down for 6 months and we're actually able to do that. And 6 months from now, we were like, okay, flip a switch because there's no new cases. Nobody's dying. Nobody's getting sick. As soon as we started going out again, people would start getting sick and dying again. Why? Because once you're exposed to the virus and you build up antigens to deal with it, you're still a carrier. So we can't delay this virus from running through the human population. This is idiocy. And it's why people are predicting, well, if we open the country back up, we're going to see a spike again. Of course we are. If we kept the country closed for the next 6 years and then reopened it, we'd see a spike again. This is how viruses transmute and survive. The only way, tenfold, thank you, Fred. I'm glad you're here listening live today. The only way for us to beat this virus is to start going back to normal. Now, granted, elderly people take precautions during the normal seasonal flu period. They should take precautions. And sadly, all you MFers who didn't give a damn about your health for the past 20 years and became insulin resistant and have all sorts of comorbidities as a result of your insulin resistance, you're stuck. You're going to have to stay indoors more often because you're going to be susceptible. But you're also more susceptible to dying from the regular seasonal flu. Who are we kidding? The only difference between this virus and the seasonal flu is this virus is so much more transmittable. It's 2 to 3 times more transmittable than the seasonal flu. If the seasonal flu was this transmittable, we'd have the same predicament. That's the only difference. So the sooner we get back, I can't keep doing this. I feel like I'm smothering. The sooner we get out there and start mingling and people get sick and don't die from it, and people get sick and unfortunately die from it. I know people think, Carl, are you crazy? No, those people are the ones that need to self-quarantine. Those people need to take precautions. Those people need to start thinking about their health now. Now they're going to think about their health. Oh, I got to think about my health. But we can't freeze this virus in place and beat it. The only way to beat this virus is to get out there. No one in the media is discussing this. This is the God's honest truth. Ask a virologist. Just ask one. Say, hey, if we literally froze the country for the next 2 years, when we came out in 2 years, would this virus be gone? They go, oh, no, of course not. Oh, really? So why the F are we doing this then? Why aren't we just telling the people most likely to die from this virus, stay home, self-quarantine, let everybody else get back to life? And governors, I'm sorry. I used to say, well, they're well-meaning but misguided, but they're not well-meaning and misguided. They have no idea what they're doing, except they love the power to tell people you can't travel. You got to wear a mask when you go into a store. Those things are not laws. They're voluntary. All these things that governors are telling us we have to do, they're voluntary. They can send the police out to our house and well, we're writing your name down. We know you exist, but show me the law. Take me to court and let's see if a judge puts me in jail for this. It's all voluntary. When people realize this, they can tell these governors to F off. Man, my question is, where do they think the virus is going to go? We play hide and seek with the virus. Haha, exactly, Patrick. We need to get back out there so it works its way through the population, because then what happens is we actually develop immunity that can be passed on to others because the virus mutates in us. Man, I am tired of being directed by stupid effing people. They're the stupid. It's almost like if you're a stupid person, you rise to the top in politics. If you're stupid and easily corrupted, you can be a politician. It's why I'll never be a politician. I would have to be a complete sellout to be a politician, to agree with what's going on right now. I'm tired of it. So this virus will not go away if people like Governor Andy Beshear lock the population up for the next 10 months. It's going to come back. And if anything, it's going to kill more people. Thank you. Thank you, Ivo Sue, my good friend. I got to come and visit you someday. Because I know you live in the sun. I want to be where you are. All right, that's it. Start talking about this with your friends. Start explaining to them that we cannot hide from this virus. We must meet it head on. And if you are sick and one of the people that they're saying you're going to have a comorbidity, stay the F home. But let the rest of us get back to our lives. All right, that's it for today. We have great shows planned all week long. Thanks to the lovely and talented Elisa Profumo. Share this show. Please share the shows. I ask people to do this all the time. Start a watch party. Just click start a watch party next time you watch a live show. Fred Shore, one more comment before we go. Or they have stakes in pharmaceuticals like Ducey and AZ. Yes, of course. Of course. And they do. And people, when you say this stuff, oh, you're a conspiracy. No, they do. Listen, I have been trying for 3 days now to find the budget line in the federal government's budget of the money that the CDC makes on the now 30 patents it holds on vaccines. Remember, they hold those patents for a reason. They hold those patents because they can then license those vaccines out. So it's making our government money. Now, is it going right into Fauci's pocket? Probably not, but it's why they made him the czar of science. It's why he's been there through like 5 presidential administrations now. I mean, he just keeps licensing vaccines, and then there's a vested interest for them to promote vaccines because the government makes money. It's just like tobacco. I've said it before. You can kill people in this country as long as the government gets their VIG. For those of you who don't know what VIG is, it's the vigorous. If you borrow money from a loan shark, it's not interest. It's called VIG. And if you don't pay it, you get killed. So the reality is that you can kill people in the United States. I mean, look, Vioxx killed 50,000 people. No one from Vioxx, from the makers of Vioxx, ever went to jail. Why? Because they paid big fines. The government got big money. Like, okay, you killed 50,000 people. Write us a check for $60 million or whatever it was. I don't know. You can kill people in the United States and probably in other governments as well, as long as the government gets a cut of it. Proof of that is tobacco. If people really gave a damn about human life in America, politicians would be thinking about how to get people off of tobacco products and outlaw them once and for all. 1.5 million a year die from tobacco. Everybody's wringing their hands about, well, we lost 28,000 or 60,000. Yeah, it's a horrible number. But why don't you think about that number when people are starting to smoke cigarettes? 1.5 million every year. The CDC knows it. That's the CDC's number. So let's stop the BS and let's get back to life so this virus can work its way through and we can build up immunity and not be afraid of it any longer. That's it for today. My rant. People are going to, I know on a couple of websites, they say, well, he yells too much. I don't yell too much, but I do get spirited when I feel something strongly. So there you go. All right, see you tomorrow. Thanks for listening. Share the show, please. Share the show, please. Share the show, please.